Well, hello, friends. Welcome back to the practice of being human. Today, before we move into this week's episode, I wanted to name a thread that I think has been running through a lot of my work recently. And in light of last week's episode with Eliza and how we talked about, for her, parenting, motherhood being something that really stretched her and deepened her and excavated her in ways that she was not quite prepared. And in our coffee visit, the emotion was most prevalent, most present when we were talking about parenting and her kiddos. And of course, the tenderness that I felt in this process was real because I just wanted to say yes, and I get it, and I hear you. And any of us who are parents are going to say, I hear you. If we're worth our salt, right? Our kids can bring us to our knees. Parenting can truly expose us and reveal us to ourselves in ways that no one else can. And that's the beauty of it, and also the incredibly holy walk of it. It's the undoing, and it's also the making of. And so this week, I wanted to continue a little bit on that theme. I'm going to be talking about relationship, and I'm going to be talking about a young man in particular with whom I had this gorgeous conversation. And he's this, just a delightful human and in his 20s, and talked to me about a situation that recently he had experienced that was really unsettling and upsetting and quite dramatic by all accounts when it comes to guys and gals and a little bit of that messy dance that can take place when there's interest and there's others involved and there's miscommunication, there's confusion, there's maybe not direct communication, there's lots of other people kind of in the mix. And you can just imagine it can really muddy the waters. And so, as I was talking to this young man, it very differently than maybe parenting and the exposure of this and just kind of the bringing to his knees relationship for him, and historically speaking, has been the thing that has really challenged him. And there's a common theme that keeps kind of happening for him in these relationships. And so we talked a lot about the pattern that he is experiencing and finding. And we shifted the focus from the girl and then this friend of his who was kind of in the mix, involved in terms of he also too expressed interest in this gal. And this young man, initially, although this friend knew he was interested in her, when he asked him, "Hey, do I have the green light?" This young man said, he didn't say it in these words, but I don't think he felt he could say no. I'm going, but he was thinking to himself, you already know I'm interested in her. And he, I think, was kind of trusting himself of like, you know what, this shouldn't be a problem. Like we'll have time. She and I will spend some time together, and this isn't going to take root with this other friend and her. Or who knows exactly. I don't quite know exactly what he's thinking, but I think in general, he didn't feel he could say no. And that we'll come back to later in the episode, but I think it's an important piece to just mention. And so there's this common theme, as was true with last week's episode for Eliza and this week's episode for this young man. Life has this incredible way of bringing us to our knees. And I always like to say life is our curriculum. And what this school does is that it challenges us to learn, and it exposes our weaknesses. It exposes us where we might have wounds and where we might be super insecure, and maybe fear is driving the bus. Maybe there's a lot of pain underneath the armor. Wherever we're still defended, life has a way of exposing that. And for this young man, it was and has been through relationship. And he's been living an old story in relationships, and this was no different, that was more along the lines of the fear of not being chosen. And so, really trying to appear kind of altogether in a way where he would be chosen. right? And where he would be perceived as something really special, which he is. But walking into this, he was coming from that wounded place. And so every relationship he goes into, he seems to kind of replay this dynamic with women where he's with someone who might not be fully all in on him, bought in. And by the way, he's not fully honest and straightforward with the women. And so, not in a malicious way by any stretch, but from what I understand, in a way that he tries to appear to be just fine with things when really he might not be. And so, I was trying to help him see where some of his patterning was playing into the situation that he found himself. And so, as we talked about last week, life has a way of revealing us, exposing us, and truly humbling us. And the opportunity here is to grow up emotionally. And life has a way of asking us to tell the truth. And then there's the opportunity when we tell the truth to repair and to stay or to leave, to say yes or to say no, and to stop performing and blaming and outsourcing our peace to another human, whether it's our child or it's a fellow young adult. It's no one else's work to save us from ourselves and the parts of ourselves that we have not yet learned how to hold in their beauty and their heartbreak, right? It's no one else's job. And yet we outsource it all the time. So, like parenting, relationships are often not the glamorous work, right? And it's more along the lines of brave work and holy work. And I think it's calling us to be more conscious and to live more inside of our lives. And so, what's more important than that? And so, today, as you're listening to this episode, I'd love for you to consider what relationship in your life is currently front and center. What is it currently teaching you? What keeps within this relationship potentially bringing you to your knees or keeping you in this pattern over and over and over? What's the pattern that keeps showing up that you keep wondering, why does this keep showing up? So, without any sort of judgment but curiosity, what is the pattern for you? And what are you being invited to see? And we'll talk about what this young man was being invited to see, but I just ask that you consider that for yourselves. So, I'm going to just tell you a little bit of a story. This young man, he had just returned from a life-changing trip abroad. He'd been there with fellow students as well. And this kind of trip was in one of the most beautiful parts of the world. And it was the kind of trip that can't help but change you and stretch you and expose you to the elements of all the things, right? So he was, along with encountering new cultures and new people and new experiences, he also encountered more of himself, which is, I think, so, so good, so beautiful, and yet can be so humbling and painful. So the beauty was there, the adventure was there, the friendship, the growth, and then there happened to be, as part of the story, a young woman in the mix. And then there was a friend of this young man, a male friend, who was also kind of in the mix. And there was mutual interest. This young woman was expressing interest in both men, and both men were expressing interest in this woman. But the man that I'm talking about, this young man that I'm talking about and referring to, is one who went into this thinking he and this gal had already had a connection and that he thought that would kind of prevail. Okay. So mixed signals going on, hurt feelings, miscommunication, lots of confusion, people coming in and out of this. Like there was also a lot of friends and gals and guys who got involved. There's questions about trust and honesty. And of course, it got overly blown out of proportion. Like the drama of this was, high, high, high. And what I wanted him to understand, because this is how I was seeing it, but as I listened to him, I was like, you know what? I don't think this is really a story about a girl. And I don't really think this is a story about your friend. I think this is a story about self-trust, and I think it's a story about choosing yourself. And we all, I think, understand this, especially those of us who've been living this life a little longer than young adults, which is that there's often space between what is it that we know and what is true for us and what we say, what we do. And I like to call this misalignment. Okay. There's a little bit of a misalignment that goes on when there's space between the two. And for many of us, there's a space. Now, how big is that space? I think requires a lot of work. And I think is very telling of how self-aware you are and also how authentically you want to live this life and what is true and what is armor and all the good stuff that comes with this. So as this young man was telling me about what happened, I was noticing that every time there was tension or confusion or pain, as he was talking, he had a sense of something before he knew something, right? So intuitively speaking, he already was registering a lot of things, but he was almost bypassing those things. So the flags would be raised, but he would bypass because he wanted something so much that he wasn't really willing to see all the warning signs, right? And who can't relate to this? He knew he was interested in her. He knew he felt uncomfortable with certain dynamics. He knew when something didn't sit right. And he knew when feelings were deeper than he was letting on. But instead of trusting his knowing in this, he negotiated with it. Okay. And that is really at the core of all of this because his knowing, he would bypass, he would soften, he would minimize, he would explain it away, he would edit it. And before we judge this young man, which I'm not saying any of you are, but if you are, when you're recognizing something, most of us do this every day, right? We know when a friendship feels one-sided. I have one right now that I keep coming back to and keep thinking to myself, okay, it's time to draw the line. It's time to set that boundary and what is coming from love and what is true and to be able to let go. But it's so hard to do, right? So I've been up to now doing things, saying things that a little bit in me is saying, what are you doing? But I keep doing it. And maybe in this podcast episode, I now am speaking this out loud that I am obviously in a different place and will take different action going forward and align with my insides on this. But here's the thing. We know when a relationship isn't aligned and we know when we're overcommitted, okay? When there's more interest on our side than reciprocated interest. We know when we're exhausted. We know when we're betraying ourselves. We know these things, right? But often we don't trust what we know. And why? Why do we do that? And I think it has to do with our origins, our little selves, because doesn't pretty much everything go back to that? I'm not saying that we have to go back and live there, but I am saying I think we got to go back to go forward on so many of these things and bring that little younger self along with us and have the wise person, the young adult, the full-fledged adult that we are, kind of carry us along and guide us in word and action, right? But regardless, I think there's fear. I think there's conflict. I think fear of conflict is real. Fear of rejection is universal, right? We all want to belong. There's a fear of disappointing someone, which of course none of us like to do. And there's this fear of not being chosen. So what do? We abandon ourselves along the way and we keep doing it. Not because we're weak. And that is so important to understand. This is not because we're weak, it's because we're human. So one of the themes that emerged from our conversation, this young man and I, was that so much of our suffering comes from organizing our lives around being chosen. Okay? And especially for this guy. Will they choose me? Will they like me? Will they stay? Will they approve? Will I belong? Will I be enough? And there's nothing wrong with desiring and wanting connection. We all want it. We all need it. It's food for our soul. We're wired for connection, and we are relational beings. But there's a difference between wanting connection and needing someone else to validate our worth. One creates intimacy, the other creates anxiety. And this young man was feeling a whole lot of anxiety throughout this whole process. And that little version of us, especially for this guy, the younger part of us, often believes that safety, that being okay, comes from being chosen. So the wiser version of us, what's the wiser version going to say? The wiser version is going to say that freedom comes from choosing, not being chosen. Choosing. And this, I think, goes back to an episode many moons ago. I think I talked about a young woman who was seeking a roommate for college, and she wasn't getting paired with someone. It wasn't working out. And she kept saying, I just want someone to choose me. And I said, what about how you feel about choosing someone? Are you thinking in any way, shape, or form, giving any sort of weight to you choosing versus being chosen? Right? So I think it goes hand in hand, but I think there's something so powerful about that wiser version of us that understands that our freedom really comes from our choosing, not the other way around. And it's choosing honesty and alignment and integrity and choosing relationships that feel reciprocal. They don't have to be so much work, and they don't need to garner all this anxiety, right? Unnecessarily so, and suffering and insecurity and uncertainty and confusion. That's not the nature of a healthy, grounded relationship. Now, every relationship has harmony, disharmony, repair, safety, all the things that go with it. Relationships can go through that whole harmony, disharmony, repair 20 times a day, or 100 times a day, or two. But the point is that this is choosing a relationship, a friendship that has trust at its very core, that has the choosing of ourselves. And that shift, I believe, changes everything. So one of the things I often see in my coaching practice is that people, they're not losing themselves all at once, okay? But they lose themselves one tiny compromise at a time. So when you think about that for yourself, think about what maybe in this young man went back in kind of the timeline, and I was asking him certain questions, and he could recall where he didn't fully say something honestly, even though he felt it. He didn't say it because, again, I think ultimately underneath all that was just wanting to be chosen. Okay? So we lose ourselves one tiny compromise at a time. And we say yes when maybe we mean maybe, or we mean no. And then we pretend not to care when we care deeply. Who's done that? I know I have. And along with these things, we avoid conversations, the difficult conversations, we swallow feelings, we shapeshift, and we perform. And what we're doing is we're shapeshifting to try to fit in, to be accepted, to be chosen. We're not authentically showing up. We're not being ourselves and kind of moving in the room, so to speak, in a way that is true. We're moving in the room, feeling out everything, and then trying to figure out how we want to show up to be safe, to be okay, to be chosen. And it makes perfect sense because many of us learn very early on that belonging or fitting in felt much safer than authenticity. Approval, especially when we're little people, often feels safer than honesty. And being agreeable feels safer than being real. But we all eventually pay the price for that. Because every time we abandon ourselves, you know how I talked about the distance between what is true and how we are showing up, that distance just grows. When we're abandoning ourselves, when we're making those tiny compromises over and over, we just keep getting further and further away from ourselves. And that distance is really between what we know and what we say, what we feel and what we express, who we are and how we show up. And I know for me, when I am operating from that place, it creates suffering unnecessarily. Not because, and I think this is true for so many of us, it's not because we're bad or broken, but ultimately the disconnect is with ourselves. So one of my favorite things to tell clients is this: the classroom changes. The curriculum, the life curriculum, the being human curriculum, the practice stays the same. It's a different relationship, it's the same lesson. Different city, same lesson. Different friendship, same lesson. Different job, same lesson. And this was true with this young man over and over and over. Same idea, same pattern. And we often look at these recurring patterns, and then what we end up doing, and this is where I want all of you to pay attention, is that we start to make that mean something's wrong with us, that we are bad, we're wrong. What is it about us that's defective? Why does this keep happening, right? We're asking these questions, but here's the better question. What is this trying to teach me? What if life is always for me and never trying to punish me, right? It's not against me, it's for me. What if life is teaching us patiently, lovingly, repeatedly, until we are finally able to see what we're meant to see? And this is why I think over and over we keep attracting the same circumstance, same relationship, same person, same kind of person, same situation over and over until we learn what we're here to learn. So the lesson keeps returning, not because we're failing, but because we're becoming, we're learning. And this young man, each situation that he's found himself in, he is learned and he's growing. And as I really tried to express to him, these aren't all the same, but they're all showing you a very similar theme. And the similar theme is learning how to self-trust. It's learning how to choose yourself. And you are slowly learning what that is. And you've been doing things differently in each relationship, a little bit here, a little bit there. And that is growth, and that is something to celebrate. So as we talked, I found myself thinking about the younger version of this young man, because I'm sure he was just this delicious little being who learned somewhere along the way that it wasn't always safe to be fully himself. And that little boy who worried about being accepted, he wanted to be liked. He wanted to be chosen. He wanted to be enough, and he wanted to be safe. That was so big for him. But here's what I want all of us to understand. That little one doesn't disappear. He doesn't vanish when we're 22, 23, 28, 48, 68. He comes along for the ride. And the goal here is not to get rid of him. The goal is to turn towards him, to understand him, to reassure him, to put your arm around him. But don't put him in the driver's seat. Let him drive shotgun. Because here's the thing. If we put him in the driver's seat, fear, and that fear of not being chosen, makes the decisions. And fear, what does fear do? It edits us. It armors us up. It performs. It people pleases. It stays silent. It seeks approval. But the wise us, the wise self, does something different. So we put the wise self in the driver's seat because the wise self tells the truth. The wise self trusts what it knows. And the wise self allows disappointment. It allows not being chosen, but knowing that even when we're not chosen, we are chosen. We are always chosen. We choose ourselves. And not everyone is for us. Not every relationship, every situation is for us, right? They're all there to teach us, to grow us, to learn us, to excavate us. But they're not maybe, as Esther says, they're maybe a love story, but not a life story, right? Who's our life story versus our love story? Well, I have my one, Craig Brummel. He's my life story. But I have a few love stories in there from growing up. And yeah, so keep in mind that the wise self is what understands that honesty may cost us certain relationships, but dishonesty is not worth the cost because dishonesty costs us ourselves. And we no longer abandon ourselves once we understand that is a price that is too high to pay. So, this is the part that I wish every young adult could hear, and honestly, every human. What if nothing is wrong with you? What if the pattern isn't evidence that you're broken? What if the heartbreak isn't evidence that you're unlovable? Or the disappointment isn't evidence that you're going to never find your person? What if this experience is simply revealing the next layer of your growth and preparing you for your person ultimately? I love thinking about that. You're all growing and becoming more and more yourselves. And as you're doing that, the person that you're going to be with, ultimately your partner, is doing the same thing somewhere else in the world. Could be right beside you, could be someone you already know. But regardless, trust that unfolding, surrender to that knowing. The next layer of your healing, your freedom. Here's the thing. Life keeps exposing our flaws, our imperfections, our wounds, our limitations, our faulty belief systems. And life exposes our opportunities, okay? And our opportunities to learn to trust ourselves more deeply, what a rich opportunity. And for this young man, he's in process of learning what that is. And I see him. The lights are turning on. He's getting it. He's connecting the dots. He's learning the importance of speaking more honestly, not just when it's convenient, but across the board, to be more intentional, to live more authentically. So today I want to leave you with a question. Where in your life are you waiting to be chosen? And what might change if you started choosing? And the choosing would be honesty, truth, and most especially yourself. Choosing the relationships that align with your values, that feel most authentic, that are reciprocal, and to understand that maybe the work of becoming isn't learning how to get chosen, but it's learning how to choose yourself, to trust what you know, to say what you mean, and to let your actions align with your truth. So, my friends, stop abandoning yourself for belonging. I will speak this from the rooftops. This is so key and core to our work. Believe that people meant for you will never require you to become someone else, but they will help you become more and more you, because the deepest relationships in our lives are not built when we are performing. They're built when we have the courage to show up honestly, vulnerably, authentically, messily, and trust what is meant for us will meet us there. And that is the most lovely of invitations. This is the work. That is the practice. And that, my friends, is the practice of being human. So until next time, take good care of yourselves. Be gentle with your hearts. Trust what you know. And remember, the classroom may change, but the lesson is always leading you home to yourself. Peace.